Javier Marias naming his book Osos is so incredibly clever and apt, just like the book itself. Osos is a name full of meaning, because it not only characterizes the setting and the plot, but the atmosphere itself. It encapsulates it and preserves it, much like Oxford itself is described as the city preserved in syrup. I hope you're comfortable because we're about to take on an academia novel, and more than that, on one that hits close to home, because Osos is set in Oxford. So let's talk about All Souls, the literal meaning first. All Souls is a reference to All Souls College, a constituent college of Oxford University, which, in case you haven't heard, is one of the most prestigious colleges in the world, one of the most difficult exams to get into ever, and essentially there are like 9 people in total in the entire college. They're automatically made fellows, there are literally millions of pounds in endowment, and it's one of those extremely prestigious research institutions that only take the very best and that not much is known about beyond what is written on the website. You've heard the phrase ivory towers about Oxford, and essentially ivory towers is literally about Osos, because Osos is 2 big towers and it is that kind of place that has that reputation of being hard to get into, inaccessible. If you may, as an Oxford student, interact with graduate students from other colleges by chance, it's very rare that you see All Souls just because there are so few of the people in the entire college. Take one undergraduate intake can be 100 people. A graduate intake can be, I don't know, also close to 100 depending on the college. It could be 50, it could be 60. It is not 9. So All Souls is incredibly prestigious and closed off. And that's the reputation. It feels real and unreal at the same time. Such a big part of the world that is Oxford and yet so removed from it. Now that is one part of the novel. The other part of the novel is a play on the word All Souls. A play on words. How perfect, considering that our protagonist is a Spanish lecturer, a visiting lecturer on Spanish literature at Oxford University. So the narrator reflects on Oxford and explicitly says that the time is gone. That's it. It has passed. He reflects on it and he says all that remains now are the souls of the story, the souls of the character, everything is the souls that remain. He lives in Madrid now, he's back in Spain, his native country, and looking back at the 2 years he spent at Oxford, he can't help but feel how sharp of a contrast it is, how surreal it feels, how it feels almost as if it didn't happen to him, and yet clearly it did, and so he wants to put it down and to set it out. It feels dead, departed, unreal, and yet strikingly real. So I suppose in a way it feels like a spirit, like a soul, like something incorporeal yet clearly tangible, able to be felt, because in All Souls we are quite literally surrounded by souls. All souls. Everything. All the souls. The plot, the atmosphere, and of course the characters themselves, the souls that make up the story. So I think you get the genius of the wordplay, and let's talk now about the narrator who leaves behind these souls, who leaves behind these characters as he leaves Oxford, and all the quirky characters who make it up. It is these quirky characters that punctuate Oxford and make Oxford, well, Oxford. They make the city because they too are removed from the world as much as they are a part of it. And it just doesn't feel real. So Oxford is a university, right? And a big part of university are, well, the students. It's the student life. And yet somehow the students are just utterly removed from the novel. They make up the background, they make up the setting, and they're just not there. They're just not felt. Their presence is somewhere in the background, much like a wandering spirit whose presence you got used to in your house. And then again, our narrator, our nameless narrator, our protagonist, is literally a lecturer. Shouldn't he be interacting with students at some point? No. In fact, almost not a single time in this entire novel, in the entire 200 pages, is it said that he interacts with a student. And it's just, what does he do, you might ask? How is this an academia novel if there are no students, if they're souls, if they're removed? Well, it's because the character himself is like a lost soul. He spends his time wandering around the streets of Oxford, looking at the beggars that he recognizes and doesn't recognize, and then going and browsing in secondhand bookshops in order to find the remnant of a long-forgotten, obscure writer. The best part of this is that Marias and the narrator both realize how how absurd it is if you think about it then, that everybody seems so removed from everyone else, that no one seems to be fully alive, that everyone just seem to be, well, souls, which is again I think the brilliance of the title of the book, which encapsulates the course so perfectly. It's so genuine yet also so ironic as a novel, and it's beautiful to witness Marias absolutely towing this line between irony and genuineness. This is dark comedy at its finest because the book literally walks along the blade making fun of itself, making fun of the characters, making fun of the reader, making fun of Oxford, making fun of our assumptions about Oxford. Also is more like all shots fired. Quite literally, because you could say all the shots fired hit their targets. It's not just the students, of course, right? It's a university. What about the lectures then? Well, we have this, in the words of the narrator, fat economist who spends the entire dinner and his entire life talking to everyone he meets about some strange, long forgotten tax on cider that is just on cider, that the narrator tries to, you know, blur out of his head every time he starts talking. He tries to drown out the voice. So we have that lecture. We also have an interrogator for the British government who goes up to London in order to find Soviet performers who want to defect to the UK and try to determine if they're trustworthy characters and get them to stay. And then we also have a lecturer who's a homosexual and dying from an unnamed illness. At once a mentor to the friend and just never understood. So Marias and the narrator both fully play on the stereotype of this Oxford academic that we have, because Oxford is an institution that we see, well, that we, particularly in pop culture, we see as just closed off, its own world, and in many parts, in many ways, that is very true. It is its own thing, it is its own system, it is its own structure, it has its own people. And Marias points out the stereotypes and essentially just plays on them. And he points out how absurd and how ridiculous so many of these things are, but also how at the same time they're true. So I think it's a really, really, really fine line and fine distinction to make. And I think, honestly, it can only be appreciated if you have ever been in these tight-knit environments that are so wonderful yet also just so surreal and ridiculous at the same time. I'd also like to say that not all of this is true. So I think that the key to having fun with this novel is to think about what is true and what is not really true and what is just a quip from Marias. And Marias has lots of quips. It's an incredibly hilarious novel in many ways, almost as much as it is bitterly sad and in many ways regretful and disappointing in the atmosphere that it brings, not in the novel itself. The novel, I think, is wonderful and so smart in many ways. But we've talked about this, the students and the professors, but what else is in this phantasmagorical cocktail Oxford mix? Well, of course, the soul of the obscure English writer John Gosworth, who I mentioned earlier. So our nameless narrator spends his days in the pursuit of looking for rare editions of this long-forgotten writer in bookshops. How ironic then that the most real character out of all of the characters is the one that feels the most unreal. John Gosworth was a real figure with a fascinating life. He is a writer who's written only a couple novels that are really not well known, even in small circles. A footnote to many biographies and biographies of writers that are also not so famous at that. He's traveled to India, he's traveled to Burma, he's traveled to all these exotic places. We lose so much of the chain events that connects him. We know so little about this man who went by so many names, except he somehow managed to become the king of Redonda. It's a tiny island next to Antigua and Barbuda, and he appears suddenly to us with this very real photograph, and then you turn over the next page and what a shock! It's his death mask. It's a clay mask, and he's just another soul that's gone in and wandered among the pages of this book. He's a soul that is present as our narrator wanders around these streets looking for him, and he somehow finds himself having unexpected connections to Gothworth in every part of his life. He's terrified to become like Gothworth, yet he's drawn to him like a moth to a flame. And honestly, I could say the same way that he's drawn to women. This man is, yeah, obsessed with women, and he keeps thinking about all the women who walk into his life and walk out. He's obsessed with a woman that he met once on the train to Oxford at a station that he saw once, and he keeps seeking her out. He keeps looking for her face in these crowds of passerbys and looking for her, and yet she's just another soul. Do you see then how this book is comprised of so many souls and ghosts and spirits, and it feels so real and yet utterly distinct from reality? And of course, our protagonist, the unnamed narrator, who lets us into the most intimate parts of his life, who brings the reader into this intimate, closed off, tight knit community with its own rules, with its own morals, with its own customs. He who feels so distinct and important, but he who is also so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The novel is on the surface about an affair between our nameless protagonist and a pretty married tutor called Claire Bayes during his temporary post as a lecturer at Oxford. But it is about so much more than that. It's about academia, writing, Sundays exiled from the infinitive, as I've quoted generously from here, class, our dividers, and our relationships as well. Not just romantic, but platonic. And just genuinely relationships with people, the imprints that they leave, and how we carry those imprints forward in our life, whether to our benefit or to our detriment. And all this is explored through a sort of controlled stream of consciousness. Feel how that's like sort of an oxymoron? Well, that's because certain parts of this novel feel exactly like just like a dump of thoughts. We move from thinking about how garbage can tell us, garbage, I mean like quite literally the trash bag, the trash bin can tell us a lot about a person's life and habits, to philosophizing about, in general, life and the passage of time and aging, to going back to this like diatribe against women and how can they not be, how can they not be planning the same way that he's planning for them to have this relationship? So it sort of feels like there's an imposed structure on what is otherwise a rambling mind, in the way that I suppose you would get if you went back to the diaries that you wrote a year ago, which are just very thought dump flow, stream of consciousness, and attempted to give them, to organize them in a way that made logical sense, in a way that gave them form while not changing the style and the substance in the slightest. So the novel alternates between these just this uninterrupted stream of thoughts and these precise point target hitting quips, and it's all done incredibly fluidly. It's never jarring, and perhaps this quality comes from the narrator telling us this from the future, so it being retrospective. It's if we don't do the diary example of you fixing your own thing, it would be like me coming back to the past and accompanying my younger self and giving, detailed footnotes to every action that I do. We come to know him very well, but at the same time that distance is maintained. So I think that that actually mirrors the Oxford experience, because when you sit down to work, it's almost like the work completely absorbs you and everything else starts to seem slightly unreal. And it's happening to you, and you're aware and you're in the moment, but it also feels like you're observing yourself from a distance and just wondering at how this can possibly be you, or how this new life can possibly be yours. That's just a bit of a personal thought, because this novel really does hit quite close to home, particularly now. And starting it in October and finishing it in November, which is exactly when the Oxford term started, was a particularly charming turn of events. And yeah, that's the beauty of the novel, that it's just that blend of stereotypes but also truth that hit harder than the head of the high table banging his cutlery on the table. Marias's words, not mine. And it's things like that, especially, that are noticeable in the narrator. For example, the narrator is very clearly the stereotype of the academic. We go back to this again. He's disconnected from the world, but perhaps less so than other academics, which make this novel a possibility. He's also, you know, he philosophizes, he's an overthinker, he makes everything intellectual. It's always about turning the mundane into universal, always about making something serious, always about criticizing other people for not seeing things the same way. I suppose he's sort of like Holden Caulfield, who complains about phonies while being a massive phony himself in many ways, and I think that describes the narrator quite just fine. He comments, he observes the gossip culture, but at the same time, this book is the gossip culture because he's essentially bringing us in while also telling us, you should stay away, this is a terrible place. So it's that mix of, I think, love and hatred. And book lovers will relate and fall in love with this novel and with the characters because it is so entrenched in literature. Wandering the streets of Oxford, perusing these secondhand bookshops, going in search of obscure but apparently real and not fictional when everything else in here feels fictional authors. Russian literature, Spanish literature, English literature. Again and again we have references to events, we have allusions to what I think in many ways is an event in literature rather than an event in life, which again is also interesting to consider. The smell of old books, literary travel. I mean, our narrator is obsessed with books, which, same. But the only thing that our character obsesses about more than books is about women. He is properly obsessed. He's the stereotype of the man who has it down bad because he, like, seriously, we are not beating the Victorian angle allegations here. The narrator will observe the ankles, the shins of the woman he loves, even if the woman he loves is a woman he met once on a train. He will observe the type of shoes they wear, their plunging décolleté. Everything here is very focused on women. Can't stop thinking about the woman he met at the high table, Claire Bays, who's also at the center of this narrative, even years later. And yet, just as much as he's absorbed with women, we never really get a fully fleshed out female characters. Claire Bays is the epitome of the slightly archetypal character who also at the same time is like this amazing seductive woman but who's also focused on her family, on who she's cheating on by having this affair. But never mind that. The point is, this novel is very much about books and women because that's the thing that our protagonist obsesses over. I keep coming back to the fact that it's about an affair and that the romance itself is at the core of the novel, but really it's honestly not fair to say that this is romance or could be classified as such in any way. The affair takes on an incredibly passive role. It's mentioned, it's explicitly described for only a couple of pages. It's mentioned in passing, but that's just because he's thinking about it rather than it being there. Honestly, it's just so much more. It's so much more about life and work and how we move on and how we treat people that it seems almost like secondary. Like all retrospective novels, also has that slightly distinct, little bit bitter, nostalgic quality, which drives us into a thoughtful and pensive mood, which makes it even sharper, which startles us even more to have these sudden quips, these sudden lines of wit, the startling sarcasm that Marias employs when his jokes and his pointed comments inevitably hit home in some ways. It startles us out of our reverie, it makes us laugh or gasp or, you know, just be offended or slightly insulted in a good way, and we just can't help but keep on reading because it's so deliciously scandalous. The humor is so dry yet also so vividly rich, and I think also this is truly a novel of contrast because it manages to combine so many things and get it done so perfectly. And how is it that his lucid prose just makes these 200 pages such a complex masterpiece? So much happens in this novel, and yet realistically not much happens at all. This is definitely not for those who want a book with, you know, this insane action-packed plot, because essentially it's like taking one step, but it's a massive step around the entire globe, and you come back to exactly where you were standing before, and it's like you haven't moved outwardly. Nothing changes. We fully expected this affair to start, and if an affair starts, it at some point needs to end, or there needs to be some resolution to it. Also feels like everything changed at once. I suppose it's like looking back at your progress a year later and being like, how much changed? How much did I change? So maybe that's one of the reasons that I think people can relate to this novel, because it is about small change as individuals and moving on and growing older and reflecting and nostalgia. And I also think that that's why reading this while at Oxford is a particularly poignant experience, because it just manages to hit home all the harder, even though it will hit home even if you're not at Oxford. Because I know, well, for me at least, the personal part of this is this, that I know so many of the places that the narrator talks about. I walk the same streets. I also see a similar sort of people that he frequently describes. Many of the things I see are also distorted. Certain places are not where they're supposed to be geographically. Certain places are unfamiliar. Then certain habits are new and I have not heard of this, like talking to someone for 7 minutes on your left, 5 minutes on your right at a high table. No, but it's also blended into what I do know, like going to foremost, because I've been at Oxford for, well, halfway through the term now. A good book frequently comes along at the right time, and I think this was just the right time for me. And I think that some types of it are meant to offend a certain type of Oxonian and Exfordian. But really, for me, I just took it in light humor, sort of like a friendly roast, if I can say that. But all I can say is that there are parts of it that get the culture exactly right. The gossip, the information, the sense of being frozen in time, the sense of this reality. But there are also the parts of it that the novel doesn't describe, the beautiful parts of the experience. You know, the gorgeous libraries, the unique people, the greatest minds of the century, the intellectuals. So, you know, take it with a pinch of salt is all I'm saying. One last thing that I want to mention, also feels like a response to my favorite novel of all time, one of my favorite novels, John Williams' Stoner. I actually, maybe response is not the right word, maybe conversation is the better word. The two books are in dialogue to each other. For me, it feels almost like Marias could step into the pages of John Williams' Stoner and die a heroic death, or disappear off the pages, or come in as this mysterious character, this mysterious Spanish lecturer. And Stoner could just as easily be another academic described in all souls. And I think that academia novels and campus novels in general, they're close but also so removed from anything else. They're just their own distinct subgenre, if I can say that. And there's an introduction in the Penguin Modern Classic editions by John Banwell, and he says here that all campus novels are in some way an act of revenge. And I think that that is certainly so. But if it's an act of revenge, you know, the fine line between hate and love, I also think that it's simultaneously a love letter to the experience, even if it's grim and dark. But it also just shows that so many beautiful things can emerge from it, as this relationship did. In short, All Souls is for the day when you feel frozen in time, when life is rushing by. This one is for all the situationships, pining, and feeling lost in life. All Souls is for when you need to be surrounded by everything, by all at once, to lose yourself and to find yourself in souls different from your own, in All Souls.